All right, and we are recording. Go ahead.
Oh goodness, no pressure. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So the topic that you saw sent out, SQL Server in quarantine, what I was trying to do was to identify some topics that you could work on while you weren't in the office, maybe some things you could do in the background that didn't need as much interaction with other people. Some of these fall into that, some of these don't. And I really wanted to focus on some of those things that were kind of nagging little issues that maybe you never get a chance to focus on. And really kind of turning from, come on, click for me, from a specific feature presentation to one that talks about how the features you use interact with your policies, your procedures, and your tools. And then we're going to focus on getting you better security and getting you better manageability out of that. So that's kind of where this comes from. And a whole lot of this is going to be focused around logging and security. So I understand you had an extended event session last month. We're going to cover that briefly, but the big thing I'm going to talk about is where to push extended events to make it really easy for you to see them. We'll talk about the combination of Kerberos, SPNs, and static DNS. That's one of the things that a lot of folks kind of just live with and never take the time to get right. And I'm going to encourage you to take the time to get that right. We'll talk through one of the things that drives me absolutely nuts, which is linked servers. So convenient, so helpful, so annoying, such security problems. And then there's a tool I've written to do some SQL Server configuration that I'd like to show you and give you a chance to download it and have a look at it. And then we'll look at some security at the end. And so with that, we're going to jump in. So you've probably seen lots of articles on how to use extended events. And what I'm going to do is show you just briefly querying a session, but I've got some very specific events that I would like to see you capture. So you look at SQL Server and it gives you, let me make sure I'm on the right server here. I've got some extended event sessions running. And we're just going to look at this one, logstash events, and a simple query, well, maybe not so simple, gives you all my error log writtens and some errors that we had some login errors there. So here's the things that I'm going to suggest you turn on. In addition to the system health, in addition to always on, I suggest you start an always on event set or a extended event session that captures all your login success and your login failures. Maybe you import that one somewhere, maybe you don't. But because these files will roll over and you can define how much space they take, it's a great thing to turn on and just leave it running in the background. You'll never really know when you'll need it. So then I've got a set of events that I consider interesting enough that I capture them. So I capture any SQL statement or any batch that takes more than 1 second of CPU or 500,000 logical reads. And I found that's a pretty good threshold to get me what I call any interesting SQL statement that comes through. So when people ask me, hey, what happened Tuesday at 2 o'clock? It's often pretty easy for me to go find that in my log and say, well, I saw this piece of SQL being run. So I capture all 4 of those: SP statement completed, RPC completed, batch completed, and the statement completed. If you're doing that, you may get duplicates in there because you'll get the SQL statement and the batch it's part of. But I found that I can quickly get through that, and it helps me capture maybe more of the things that I need. Logins we mentioned, make sure to filter that for non-cached. Is cached is 0. So you don't want the connection pooling resets, you just want the actual original logins. SQL Server has within it a thing called the blocked process report, where it will log events if there are blocking for more than a certain amount of time, and you can log those into an extended event, so I can figure that. I still run servers that use database mirroring, and so we capture all the database mirroring state changes. Any error that occurred, so if somebody does a raise error, severity 16, we capture it. Failed inserts, failed updates, failed logins, all captured. Anything that gets written to the SQL Server error log beyond a certain time in startup, we'll capture. Then the last two are deadlocks. There's two different ways to view it, the deadlock chain and the XML deadlock report. In between those, you can usually figure out what it is that's blocking things. And then recently I've started looking at these other two events. The server memory changed. Only triggers on a more than 5% memory change. So if something really pushes a lot of your SQL Server out of memory and it reduces itself at the request of the operating system, you'll capture that. And the last one is kind of a bit of a holy grail for me as I try and migrate linked servers to all new linked servers. If you're on a SQL Server, I know it's in 2016, I know it's not in 2008, it was added in one of the two in between, you can capture the OLADB call event, and that'll give you every piece of SQL going across your linked server. So I think that's a pretty good list to start with. If you do that and you monitor that regularly, you will learn a lot about what is going on with your SQL Server. So the next thing I want to show you is what I do with my SQL Server events. And I use a thing called Elasticsearch and Kibana. So this was, Elasticsearch is written as a giant text search engine. And Elasticsearch, let me open up SQL here, the cleverly called do stuff thing. We're going to make some errors and do a few things wrong. And then hopefully if my demo really works here, these will show up here on the screen automatically. So it only polls about every minute, so it's going to take it a little while to poll and get it loaded. What we have, there we go. So there's my divide by zero error that occurred. And you can see the event that happened. It tells you what server it came from. You see the application that generated it. You see who it was that did it, which was me. And you get a lot of, it captures the SQL Server version that it occurred on, as well as the more detailed version. So you get a lot of information about that error. There's a login failure that you can see, so I can go look and see what application it was that failed to log in, and what machine it came from, as well as the error log written, which gives you the IP address of that. So between those two, in pretty much real time, I should be able to track down any one of those login failures that occur. The other thing that you can do, and this is a great little interface, it's called Kibana. You can say, I just want to see a particular server, and it filters for just that server. You can say, I don't want to see error log written, I only want to see error reported, and you can filter by that. And what I do is take all those events you saw in that first list and dump all those into this one pane of glass. And so across all the servers that I manage, I see a real-time feed of all these events happening. Anytime an availability group disconnects, it pops up. Login failures pop up. Application exceptions all pop up. And then we can go wade through those and look at those. So how do you do this? Well, before you all joined, I was joking that my hobby in quarantine was writing an application to take a project I could do in 10 hours and spend 200 hours writing an application to do it. And I did kind of the same thing for logging extended events. So I built a little application that is an open source utility called XE Logstash, although I think probably soon to get renamed. And what it does is runs as a service. You tell it what servers to connect to, and it imports those events. If you want to do this, there's two ways to get started. Your infrastructure team might already be looking at this. Elasticsearch Elasticsearch ELK, the Elasticsearch Logstash Kibana stack is used a lot to capture Windows event logs and application event logs. And so they may already have a Logstash or a ELK stack in place. I've been surprised how many companies do already. And hosting is surprisingly reasonably priced from Elastic if you're willing to let your data go out of house. The little thing that you're looking at here, I think I pay a whopping $15 a month. And on some of the different indexes that I've got on here, I support probably 8 or 10 production servers on that. So you can get it really, really cheap. So when we go to configure this, it looks something like this. So it's a server that runs, and this is how we configure it. And it writes its events to a JSON file. So you can see there's the JSON file of the events being written. And if we scroll over here, we'll see some of the errors that I made earlier. So you can capture them there, as well as it writes them to this log stash. There's the endpoint that it writes them to. I say the sessions that I want to write. I filter out some events, and then there's just all the SQL that it connects to. And so it pulls every minute, goes and gets the newest events from those servers and imports them. And you can do some things like configure custom field names. For example, one of the environments I work in, they've got what they call a global namespace. And so there are some standard fields they ask you to always fill out for every event you send. And so now I'm able to go into this and see on a single screen all my SQL Server errors, all my Windows errors, any applications running that server, all on a single screen there streaming up at me. And it's a great way to do troubleshooting on that. As you look at that, you can use that little exclusion piece and just get rid of the things that you don't want to see. So the utility also builds some extra information on there outside the extended event. So it's writing the version, it's writing the domain in there, so you can filter by domain. It's also building a little what I call the exe description field, um, which let's see. So it combines not just the error message, but puts the better description in front of it. And that tries to give you a little bit better way to see that. For example, there's also a combination of the application name and the client that connects to it on there that you can use. So as you start doing this, what you'll have to start thinking about is how you build your indexes on this and how you do your retention. The way they use indexes is very different than what you do. You basically dump a bunch of JSON files or documents in here, and they all get indexed, and then they build indexes that will like roll over every day, every month, every week, every year. I've got mine set to do a certain amount of size, so I think I have it set at 500 meg. Every 500 meg, it rolls to a new index, and I keep a certain amount. The more that you can define some standard names that are common, the better off you'll be. And then in the case of the last one there, I define some fields like, for example, static DNS and the availability group name. So I'm able to then filter on that availability group name and see all the errors and issues from any one of the nodes in the availability group. And that makes troubleshooting availability group issues much, much easier. I think I've covered a whole lot of what I was going to talk about here. One of the things that I use this for a lot is to monitor deployments. So they'll put out a new version of an application, and some of the clients that I work with, they're deploying every single day new versions of their transaction processing systems. And so we can just watch crawling across the screen those error bars and see if any new errors occur. And so I'm getting the slow queries and I'm getting the exceptions from that. And it's a great way to see, hey, are there any issues with this that we need to roll back? It's also good to go back. Hey, Tuesday at 2 p.m., this thing was slow. What was it? And I can usually answer that question now. The other thing that's been really handy is some while back, we upgraded a server and we got some really weird error that I had never seen before. And I could not find much of it on the internet other than to say, you shouldn't really ever get this. With about a single click, I was able to find every other server in our environment that had that and find that it occurred when a certain version of a cumulative update got released, and finally found a note on it saying, hey, yeah, we made a mistake. It'll be fixed in the next one. But that let us pause our implementation of those cumulative updates. But there's no way I could have licked across every server in our environment to see that without something like this. The other thing that we use this a lot for is migrations. So before we do a migration, I've got every login going to that server. So I know all the applications that connect to it. I've got a great inventory of what needs to be migrated. And I can set up a filter so that I can see both the old server and the new server in a single pane of glass. I can watch for things connecting to the old server, make sure there are connections in the new server, see if there are any errors, especially permission errors. We're doing a lot of cross-domain migrations right now where we don't have trusts in place. And so as much as I'd like to say we're perfect and never get permission errors, it's just not the way the world works. And if you do upgrades in place, it's great to be able to upgrade, some number of development boxes, to let those sit for 30 days and then just go back and look for any errors that occurred. It's very simple to go back and look 30 days across a fleet of, hey, let me filter for every server that's version, 2019 and see if anything's happened to those. And I'm now going to show you either the best or worst slide. I don't know which this is. This is a graph that I looked at on the 18th. This is just a couple of days ago. Now below it, when you look at this, it has all these actual messages that you see, but this is actually from a client's dashboard that we were having a trouble with one of our availability groups. And just by looking at this, I was instantly able to tell when it started, nearly to the minute, to the second actually, once I drilled into it, and then when it stopped, and then I could begin to go look at it. And it gave me confidence that while I'm looking at this, none of the servers in the availability group were even logging an event like, hey, I disconnected and I reconnected, which typically you hardly ever notice those. So something like that gave me a whole lot of confidence that I knew what was going on and that we had addressed the issue. So it's a pretty neat tool to be able to watch those events crawl across the screen. All right, if you have any questions and want to post them in chat, now is the time to do it. And I will try and address those. Otherwise, I am going to move on to the next topic. And my next topic is everyone's favorite, and that is Kerberos. So Kerberos is really cool and quite possibly my worst enemy, maybe even worse than linked servers. I spend more time battling Kerberos due to some weird configuration changes that were made a long time ago in some environments. And I think we're ahead of everything now. It helps building brand new domains. But I want to walk through some of what Kerberos gives you because it solves one huge problem, and that is a double hop problem. Specifically, I connect as this VG user account to a application, to a website, to an SSRS box, to a SQL server, and then I want to go on to the next server, but retain who I am. And so my privilege don't escalate, I stay me. And that's the double hop problem. So Kerberos is trying to help with a couple of things. First of all is I'm connecting to this service. Is it being run by who I think it is? Because it's going to get my username and my password and be able to pass that on to the next thing and impersonate me. And then does my domain trust this service that I'm connecting to allow to impersonate me to another one? So I'm going to show you some examples in my little network, and I have a little Active Directory domain of 3 computers I built out here in Azure, which works really well for building little test demo environments. I've got the cleverly named box 1, 2, and 3, and I've got 3 SQL servers, and yes, I have one on my domain controller. And the service accounts, one running as a domain service account, the other 2 running as local service. So if you go look at that, you see that this one is running as a domain service account. And you see that the other one is running as just the local service there. And that shows up as box 2 when it goes outside it to another thing. I've also got some DNS entries that point to this because we're going to talk a little bit about some static DNS things that I'm going to suggest you do. So I've got 3 of them there, app 1, 2, and 3, corresponding to 1, 2, and 3. 2 of them are A records that point to the IP. Third one is a C name that points to the box itself. So let's look at what we need to get Kerberos configured. First of all, the SQL Server service account must be trusted for delegation, and it is not by default. And that looks like this. So if you go into Active Directory for users, there is my SQL Server service account right there. I double click, hopefully, on it, maybe. And you get a delegation tab. And by default, it's do not trust. I have enabled trust this user for delegation to any service, which is, you can debate how secure you want to be. I'll show you a different example in a second. But that allows any server running any service that I connect to proxy my authentication to another box. For the 2 that are running local system, I have to go into the computer, and box 2 is the same way. Box 3, I've said only allow it for SQL Server. And so these SPN entries that are MS SQL Service, and we'll talk about what an SPN looks like in a second. But that says that not just any service can proxy my account, only those 2 that are Microsoft SQL Server. So the next piece you have to have is that your account must not have, is sensitive and cannot be delegated. And so this one is off by default and rarely ever gets turned on, but every now and then. So under my account, if you scroll down here, that must be clear. Account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. And then the proper SPNs must be registered. So if you're running SQL Server as a local service account, it will register that for you automatically. And that looks something like this second piece, right? Whoops, I can't highlight. That looks something like the bottom thing there. You'll see when SQL Server starts up, it logs an event. Okay, I successfully registered this SPN for you. And there'll be 2 of them. One for the machine name, for fully qualified machine name with the port, and one without the port. If you're running as a SQL Server service account, a domain service account, it will not be able to register them, and you'll have to go do it manually unless you grant it permissions. And the one thing I'd say, if you're going to grant it permissions, I would find a domain admin to do it, because you do it through this convoluted thing. You open up the ADSI editor, I go into users, I find my service account, I always click that wrong, I go into properties, I go into security, I go into self-advanced, I get this thing, I scroll down and I find a self entry and I click edit. And I swear me doing this is as much voodoo, and I try and do it the same way every time. When you scroll down this massive, horrible list of permissions that you can grant, and it's sort of in alphabetical order if you exclude the read and the write. So down in the S's, there's read and write. I'm so close. Read and write service principal name. So if we granted that SQL Service account those permissions, then it could read and write its own service principal name. So I'm going to encourage you to always have SQL Server run as a local account unless you need it to run as something else. And I really thought about demoing that, but I am so scared of Kerberos that I'm just going to show you the checkboxes there. Okay, so let's talk about a service principal name. So 2 SPNs are registered and really needed by default. And that's the thing that says this is MS SQL Service, and then the fully qualified domain name, and one with the port and one without. And you can list these.
We did have a quick question, Bill.
Oh, yeah.
It was saying, are there any issues with using the same service account on multiple servers for registering SPNs?
Yeah. So there is no problem with doing that. In fact, if you're running an availability group, you most likely have the same account running multiple nodes, and you can configure that. You can manually set those up, and we're going to do something similar with the SPN here, but no, that works just fine. All right, so let me get my man window up here. All right, so we're just gonna look and see what is registered to that box 03 account. Remember, the $ account says it's the machine account, and you can see there's the box 03 demo that I'm expecting to see, and then I've got some stuff I'm gonna do later with some messed up SPN, so there's a few other ones in here. And again, what this SPN is telling you is this box 03 account, if you're trying to connect to box03.demo.loc, it expects to be running as the service account box03 which is the local machine account for that. If we do the same thing for the SQL service account, we get box01, which box01 is what's running as, and it doesn't have permission, so I went in and put these there manually. And then also the app01 is configured for that. So you can access the server by either one of those. And if you connect to either one of those names, it expects it to be running as SQL service. And if you want to go look and get a specific msSQL/box01.demo.loc, it will then find the service account for that and then tell you all the SPNs that it has. If you want to register a service SPN service account, you do the -S and you tell it for SQL Server service, for this fully qualified name, this is who is running it. And you do it both with and without the port. And this piece right here, this is what you're going to want to put in your connection string, because that's how it matches this up. When you put your connection string in, connect to this, it's going to go take that and look for a matching SPN. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble having duplicate SPNs, and we're going to look at some situations here where we have not so good SPNs. Any questions on SPNs before I try and break some logins? All right, so SQL Server will tell you for a given connection, did it get an SPN connection?
I had one quick question on
Sure.
the SPNs. First off, there's a tool, you know, that Microsoft you can download that'll help you with the creation of the SPNs for you. It'll create the statements and it'll actually fix. Yep. When you have the SQL named instance, you know, you have two entries in your SPN. One is the for the IP address and for the server name port, and then you have one for the named instance. And I don't guess you probably had a named instance in this example, but
I didn't.
Yeah, but that's sometimes you got to be aware of that.
Yeah, but what I can do is hack my slide here real quick and show you about what that would look like if I remember it off the top of my head. And I'm going to demo the Kerberos Configuration Manager here in a second. I can't remember the exact syntax, but I think it's instance or something like that. But the syntax is out there and you can go find it. So, yeah. Okay, well, let me push on and I will do some logins here. Sorry, did that cover that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, wanted to make sure that was mentioned, because in the past, I've worked with this SPN stuff in the past, and it is a headache. And if you're trying to create your own, you have to know if you have a named instance or not, and have that as one of your SPNs.
Yeah. So when you connect to an IP, and I'm using just the SQL Server, you can use SQL command syntax inside, and so I can connect inside a batch to a variety of different servers. So we're just going to look at connecting different ways. When you connect to an IP address, it will never use Kerberos. So you see here that the authorization scheme is NTLM, and it says I'm on box 2. I'm connecting to box 1 through TCP/IP, NTLM, and I am demo BG user. So it worked pretty much like I expected. If we connect to box 1 by name, we don't even need to use the fully qualified name. It'll give us Kerberos. So going from box 2 to box 1, I get Kerberos. Same thing if I do the fully qualified name. So you can go query all the connections in your environment and see who's using Kerberos and who is not. Right. So a couple of things to keep in mind, a couple of common errors that you will get. In many cases, it will fail gracefully down to NTLM if Kerberos does not work. Although there are specific cases where the Kerberos login will fail, and we'll look at some demos of that in a minute. If you have no SPN at all, it should default back to NTLM. If you got the wrong service account configured, you're just going to get a failure right away. And Kerberos is incredibly finicky. And the thing that he was referring to a second ago is Kerberos Configuration Manager. So I'm just going to show you the simplest environment. I'm going to connect to the local machine, and it will churn and such, and then it will tell you what SPNs it was looking for. And if you don't have them, it will give you a script to add them, or just say, I will add them for you. So, and then it will tell you if that account is delegated or allows delegation. So it's a great little tool to kind of go pull all the pieces together. And boy, is that tool finicky about what it needs to run. It's got to run as an admin and then be able to connect to those boxes. So, but that's a great tool to download and use. Okay, any other questions on SPNs before I push on to the next topic? We'll see how fast you all can type.
Looks like we're good.
All right. So I've been through a variety of different ways to try and get a level of indirection through what an application or a person connects to and the SQL Server itself. I've been through SQL aliases, I've been through host files, I've been through host files that were deployed through fancy PowerShell configuration scripts to every box in the environment. I've been to host files that were pushed through Puppet to production servers. I've been through fancy DSNs that get created on machines, and they all drive me nuts. And an organization that I worked with built a static DNS, we just called static DNS domain. And theirs has a little bit different name. I created it this way, but basically all it does is just host name resolution in a domain that exists for nothing else except this. And so if you go look at the DNS, you can see my actual domain, demo.loc, box 1, box 2, box 3. And I just created a static hosts zone and started creating some names here. And the place that started doing this, they just prefixed all the databases with a DB, and I just kind of followed that across. So I've got a DB Apo1, a DB Apo2, and an O3 that is the C name. And because those are not tied to any domain or any server or any version of SQL, we can use those as servers are migrated from different domains to different versions. And it works really, really, really well. I've been really happy with that. And the trick is, at least what we've done is, nothing ever connects to the IP or machine name. Everything has to go through a static DNS entry. And so I've got a lot of confidence when we go to migrate a SQL server that all we need to do is change that one static DNS entry, and everything that connects to it is going to move over to it in pretty much real time. There's some latency there. So some examples there. The group that I've worked with the most that's done this is really settled on really short names. So apps for application server, DW for data warehouse. You know, DBTXN might be a TXN server. We'll talk a little bit more about those, some naming options in just a second. Let's see, and the other thing I wanted to show you here was what this looks like connecting to SQL. And so keep in mind, if you want to get Kerberos entry configuration on this, you're going to have to manually configure these SPNs. SQL Server has no idea these names exist, so you're going to have to go create these on your own. So here's this APO1 that connects to BOXO1, and it tells me there I am on BOXO2 connecting to BOXO1. Looks fine. Same thing for APO3. Kerberos looks just fine. Now I created an entry in my hosts file just for BOXO3. There is no SPN for that at all. When I run that, I still connect to box3, but it fell back to NTLM because there was no SPN for Kerberos to use. I have another static DNS with no SPN. And then I have one that points to the wrong service account. So this is what you get when it's configured incorrectly. And you really don't get much of a, I mean, it tells you what's wrong. The target service principal name is wrong. And so it tells you right away to go look at your service account and you know, see if you can figure out, or your SPN, and see if it's pointed to the right service account. So we do, in our cross-domain migrations, have to update those SPNs and say, all right, the new SQL Server is now running, or this service is now running as this service account. So on the benefit side, you get a pretty simple naming scheme. You know, we're using this in the 80 to 150 server range without any issues at all. If you've got 10,000, maybe you're in a different scenario, but it really works well for us. You've got one source of truth as to where things connect to. Migrations become so much easier. You can use the CNAMEs, a DNS CNAME to point to the AG listener name, and that works well. Just about any client that you talk to is going to support you know, using a DNS to that. Downside, if you have multiple instances and you're assigning multiple IDs, or you need to assign multiple IP addresses for that. So that's kind of a challenge there. And you can have latency as those update, just depending on you know, how frequently you have that set up. And as much as I love to control my own world, there are certainly areas where they don't ever let me go near DNS. So whenever we need changes, we've got to schedule that with the network engineer to get that done. Okay, so this is where we break away from the kind of the somewhat objective things and say, one of the things I spent a lot more time on lately is trying to figure out how to name things that work well and continue to work well. I've been fortunate enough to work with some organizations for, I think the longest one is something like, I don't know, 12 or 13 years now, and some at 9 or 10 years. And so I've gotten to go through a couple different generations of database servers and environments and domains, and have built some things that, that worked out pretty well. So what I'm going to do is just suggest some things that worked well for me. The things that work well, that you think will work well for you, I would encourage you to steal them all. If you need to tweak it to be better for you, you know, good for you. So we prefix everything for the database with a DB dash, and we know that it's a database. It's as much, I think, to group them all in the list together that we look at. We also look at some type of a geographic code, maybe the UKLO for the servers in London, CA for Canada. Thinking about maybe who manages it as opposed to where it is. So if I see a particular server having an issue, I know by the name I need to contact the European DBAs and coordinate with them. Don't forget you can use a tree in there, so I can separate my UK from my US servers and, you know, reuse the same name but just in a different area. Where it gets tricky is, do you name the DNS for the server itself or for the various applications on it? So we have some things where what I call the unit of migration, the thing that has to migrate together is, 14 databases on a server. And to support our transaction system, we need all 14 of those. So those all have to migrate together. That's easy. We have another server that I named here DB apps. That's kind of just the catch-all leftover. And so the question is, do you build a DB apps name that points to the whole thing, or do you try and build a DNS for each one? If you build it for each one and then you fail the server, you've got to fail them all unless they CNAME back to the first one. So what I usually do is try and start with a more generic name, and then as things need to move, they get their own static DNS that can initially point back to the main static DNS and then gets repointed when we do the migration. The other thing that's interesting to do is if you do trace routes to popular sites, you'll see how a lot of ISPs and internet providers name their servers and routers, and they often have lots of those spread out all over the country. So you'll see lots of airport codes on server names, and it's interesting to see how they name things in a way that tells them what they are and what they do. So that's kind of my my spiel on naming static DNSs. I really encourage you to do that. That's been a big win every place I've done it in terms of simplifying migrations and simplifying how we connect in. All right, so if you have any questions on static DNS, now is the time to ask them. And I'm going to slowly work my way over to linked servers. Boy, if you thought Kerberos was interesting, let's get to linked servers and Kerberos together. So linked servers are both incredibly convenient and sometimes they just drive me up a wall. It is so easy to just do a select star from a remote server, select the databases out, fits right in with SQL there, no data has to be synced. You just go grab what you need. You can execute stored procedures. A lot of people configure linked servers so that they cross as a particular login, and I think I have one of those configured, although I'm going to be darned if I can remember where I built that. That's one of the downsides of, oh, looks like I was looking at this. So you can, well, I didn't do it, but you would put in here a login here, and you'd say whenever you go across this linked server, always use this login. And so everybody on that server becomes that permission when they cross the linked server. So you don't know who's going across it. You don't know what they're doing. You may have had permissions increased across. I have talked to multiple organizations, and when I looked at their linked server, so their main server, they'd have a pretty restrictive set of permissions. Then their linked servers would all allow system administrator access to anybody who got on the server. And so if you couldn't do admin stuff on the main server, you could just go to the next server, link server back into it and become system administrator. And their response was, well, that's the only way I could make it work. Okay, so the best way to have a linked server work is to cross it as yourself. And that looks something like this. So I'm going to connect to this APO1. So I'm using a static DNS. And as you're going to see, it's going to give me Kerberos authentication. And I'm going to go from APO1 to APO3. So I'm sitting on box 2. I'm going to box 1 using a static DNS, getting Kerberos. Now I'm going to link server across to box 3. And this is actually configured as a static DNS also. And boy, an hour ago I got Kerberos. Here's hoping I still do. There we go. So you see there's my original connection to box 1. There's box 1 going to box 3, still as Kerberos. So that lets you, if you get all this configured right, that lets you prevent any privilege escalation and stay as yourself. Now, if you have to use SQL Server accounts, SQL Server logins, and you might, if you happen to be in an environment that has some domains that don't have trusts but still need to share data, you might find yourself having to use SQL Server logins to connect to it. And what you'll find is that I'm going to connect to this DB-apps01 using this demo login. Again, I had this server configured to just pass this authentication across. I have the exact same login and exact same password configured on apps03. And as long as the password and the username match, it stays as me. So I connect in as demo SQL using SQL authentication, and I go from box 1 to box 3 using SQL authentication. So between those two, that should give you a really good start on preventing privilege escalation using linked servers.
If you could go to the GUI for the linked server setup under the security tab, one thing I never really understood is, all right, so that top half where it says local, I've never populated that. I've only used the buttons at the bottom. Either the last one be made using the security context of some SQL login on another server, I mean on the server I'm trying to connect to, link to, or my current login. I'm not sure what not be made would actually do for you. But
so what
go ahead.
Did I just do that wrong? I think I just did that wrong. I think I did not hit the save part of that.
Local removed.
All right, let's make sure that really saves this time. All right, so what this says is, for any login that's not defined in the above list, we're going to use a local security context. So in my example here, I've got app01 running as my demo service account. That works just fine. But I have also said that if I connect as demo SQL, connect to this other one as a login called nope with a bad password. And so now I'm going to go connect with demo SQL, and somewhere hopefully that's going to fail depending on if I built that right or not. Hey, look at that.
Yeah, so that's the login field for you. So is that user not exist in the database? Because you get logins at the server level, a user at the database level.
Yeah, we should see here just in one minute, we'll see a login failure for a login called nope. And so what this says is when you go across this linked server, try to log in as a SQL Server login named nope. You can also use a domain login there. So.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I've just never used that top half, and I just was curious.
It's oh, there we go. So there's my login failure. Login failed for user nope. Yeah, so we've used it a fair bit to say, hey, all these domain accounts get to go across as themselves, but this one service account goes across as somebody else that we set up some special permissions for. So that's our most common use case for that. And so when we build these, instead of just clicking the server name and the and saying add, I prefer to name them and then point them to the static DNS, and then that says, you know, go use yourself to authenticate. So let's talk about linked server name. One of the things that I'm really going to encourage you to do is to use a character in your linked server name that forces you to put it in brackets. If, like some unnamed people who look an awful lot like me have done in the past, if you name a server for something like a database name that's on another server, and you go try and search for that code, you're going to find that just littered with anything that might reference that in a comment or anything else, and it is a pain to then find them all and get them changed. The more you make it something you have to enclose in brackets, I like dashes myself, the the easier it is to search, because you can go put this text in right here and you can know that you're going to find it because you know that those brackets are there. So I would encourage you to name them in a way that makes it maybe a little more painful to type, but it's a whole lot easier to manage and work with later. Please never name it for the SQL Server or the IP address. I still have SQL servers I deal with called SQL 02. And you know, when they built that in 2003, I'm sure it was a great server, but I have no idea what that points to. And please never point it to an IP address. It is annoying as heck when you go try and type that in and find it points to a different IP. I put in there to consider something timeless. I think in terms of focus less on what our environment looks like now and more on what are you going across this link server to do. So we've had a lot more luck. Since we've had static DNS entries, we began to name all our link servers for those static DNS entries. I've also considered naming them with some kind of a prefix on top of that to get another level of indirection, but I don't really know that that's necessary. And I know that because these are all named DB apps or something like that, that I can find them easily in source code. I can filter for them easily in extended events because I'm logging what goes across that. So that code is pretty easy to track down and change if I ever need to. So that is my spiel on link server naming. Any questions on link servers before I push on to the next thing?
Just one note I would, sorry, I'm taking up so much of the time here, but like whenever I use a SQL login to connect to the link server, I always try to give it a name of the server it's coming from.
Yeah.
So the server I'm running the query on underscore, you know, maybe the name of the database. That way I can cross-reference it easily.
Yeah, I do the same thing. A lot of my link servers that are SQL Server names are called link server from. But I'm getting away from that for the specific reason that more of them are configured to always be made at the current context. Hopefully the login will be the original login that initiated it, which is, you know, whatever service or whatever person that was. And I can get away from that. But I do the exact same thing for a lot of mine. I've got link server from XYZ all over the place. All right. Comment. Well, I'm going to jump on to, well, I'm going to go to a slide actually. So I've started messing around a bit with desired state configuration. And Puppet is the big beast in this world, where you go into a series of configuration files checked into a version control system and push a button and poof, Puppet goes and does things to this. And it's been pretty interesting to me to watch the infrastructure team of one of my clients. I ask about getting XYZ installed, and they go, sure, which servers do you want it on? I'm like, well, I don't want to name too many because it might be whatever. And they're like, no problem, we'll put it on all of them. And 30 minutes later, the application shows up on all the servers. And it's because Puppet pushed it out to all of them. That's the one I probably know the most. I've also worked a little bit with Ansible and Chef, which do similar things. And Microsoft SQL Server, Microsoft decided to write one of these, and I was so excited to try and work with it. It's in PowerShell, it lets you do a lot of neat stuff. And I eventually, after hours and hours of work, I got it to change one thing on one server. But to me, I had to be an administrator on the box of the machine where it ran, the machine it was hosted on, and the machine it was connected to, as well as a SQL Server system administrator. And there was some kind of weird server's account involved too. It drove me up a wall. I couldn't stand it. And so I had this weird quirk about me that there is no problem that when I run into it and I can solve it in 10 hours, I won't go spend 200 hours or 1,000 hours and write a tool to do the stupid thing. So I, of course, wrote my own. And there's the URL to download. And I'd like to show you that. I've just started releasing this in the last few weeks. That's been kind of my quarantine project that I've done. And it looks a lot like this. So I tried to find a file configuration that made sense, was pretty easy to type, simple for DBAs to remember. It does not plug into Puppet or Chef or Ansible or any of the others. It's pretty much a standalone tool. But what you do is you go define the targets that you want to connect to. In this case, box 2 is the only one I'm going to configure. We'll do box 1 and box 3 in a second. And you define a variety of standard settings. And I support about 15 different kinds of things so far. You can create logins. You can create logins with passwords. You create logins with passwords in specific SIDs. You can grant server permissions. Just a whole variety of different things you can do. And so these are the things that I set up for default computer. I set a cost threshold for parallelism. XP command shell should be turned off. I just make sure it is. Disable the SA account, set model to simple, enable backup compression. I've got some fancy code here that if you pass it a -1, so it'll do any sys configuration. You just put one in here that matches what it is and put whatever value you want in. And I wrote some code for -1. I took the Microsoft document and went through their best practices and set that value for you based on that particular server. Same thing with max memory. It will also run SQL scripts. So what it does is it looks at, in this case, SP who is active. And if you're not using SP who is active, you really, really should be. It's a great little stored procedure that will tell you who's doing what, who's blocking, and show you query plans of active SQL statements. I use it all the time. So it runs a test query and tries to find if that exists. If not, it will run whatever that script is that's stored over here in this document. So let's not do that for now. So if I go test my server, it goes and tells me what it thinks it's going to do. Anything that is disabling or deleting, it tries to highlight. So disabling SA, it's going to set that to disable. It's going to switch model to simple, turn on backup compression, and set max memory from the default high number to about 5 gigabytes. These servers have 8 gigs, so that's a pretty reasonable thing. So I can then apply that change. It tells me what it's going to do, asks me to confirm, and there we go. So now when I run a test, it should give me nothing on there. So we're running on this in a couple different environments, and we've got about 30 to 40 rules per server, and we've gone as far as begun to push out SQL Server agent jobs to do maintenance for us for some of the local databases that are not backed up by our backup appliance, and it's really working pretty well. You can go uncomment the other 2 targets, save that file, oops, and it will then tell you for those 2 what you're going to do. If you're nervous, and see if I remember this, it will actually tell you the SQL that it thinks it's going to run on here. So it'll tell you, I'm going to alter database and set recovery simple. I'm going to enable backup compression. I'm going to run this SQL script. And then you can apply that to those 2 servers. And away you go. And there we go. I've configured some number of servers out there. So if you find yourself changing setting on servers or making them want to look a certain way, go download that. Tell me what you think. I'd be really interested to get some feedback on what you think of it. There's a README for a pro version in there that may require some registration at first, but right now you just got to dump a little dummy file in there that gives you the ability to assign servers to roles and has some domain-specific configuration. So it'll look at what domain you're in and only apply changes to servers that are in that domain for you. All right, any questions on that one before I move on to security groups?
I'll let you know after I download that and test it.
Good luck. Get a server configured for me. All right. And there's my little blurb on that. Okay. So I spend a lot of time in organizations. Often when I get in, I find lots of things running as SA or DBO, and I try and begin to wrap those down. At the same time, try and make it easier to manage security. And one of the rules of thumb I have is to never apply a permission to an individual account, always apply it to a group. And so some of the default groups that I try and always build on a server, the first three definitely, maybe the third one. So a sysadmin group, either a domain-wide sysadmin group, so everybody, when we build a server, this group always becomes sysadmins, or sysadmin just for this server or just for this availability group. Often we have read-only groups, so they get DB data reader in every database. I've had a lot of luck. Just recently we started doing this to create a schema in a database. One group calls it report, another RPT. Just settle on a standard and stick with it. And then you can grant exec on that schema, and then any stored procedure or user-defined function you put in there, the people that you grant read-only permission to will be able to execute that. And it's a great thing if you've got functions like that convert days to dates, that split CSVs, that do other things like that. I'd also grant it change tracking if you're using that, and maybe view show plan if you've got developers and they're trying to troubleshoot. For schema changes, the most common thing is to do the DBO. I really prefer to do a DDL admin, a DB data writer, and a DB, I think it's security admin. I never remember which one it is. So they can grant permissions on things, but they can't create new users. And I think that's a more realistic permission than DBO on that. So that's your third group. And if you've got people that need to make changes in there, whether it's DB data reader or changes on specific tables or schemas, you know, that's what I would do there. So I would let's see. So in your applications, if they're the sole user of a database, a lot of times the people that, if it's a purchased application, will want it to have DBO or SA. I have a lot more luck giving it DB data writer and DB data reader, and then exec on the database or just the schemas in the database. That's a much more limited permission. And if you live in a world like I do of SOX auditors, you're easily able to go to the auditors and say, hey, our application cannot make schema changes in these databases. Third-party packages might need that for upgrades, but if you've got stuff you've written, it's nice to be able to say, hey, the application just cannot do that. So, but the big takeaway from this is, if you can build some standard security groups, I found that probably 90% of what I need can be resolved with a sysadmin or read-only and a schema changes, and maybe 1 or 2 data changes. And so every server has these standard groups on them. And I know if somebody, hey, you know, some new person just started, they've got to deploy code. Hey, there's a group for them. Hey, this person is here, they need read-only. Hey, there's a group for them. And it becomes less me dealing with the permission and more somebody in the domain admin side dropping the right person in the right group. Let's talk about naming. So I have seen as many different naming schemes as I have companies I've worked at. And in so many cases, it's not even so much a scheme as it's whoever built it decides to name it that. And I've become more and more convinced that a good group naming scheme can really make your life go a long way. Especially when you can think to yourself, hey, this is this kind of application or this kind of permission, and the name for the group should be somewhat obvious. So I built this standard here for one of the groups that I work with, and their entire description of this is about 2 full pages long, but it basically works into this, some kind of a bucket. The bucket can be the country, the business unit, maybe similar to what we talked about for DNS names before. This organization has business units all over the country, or sorry, all over the world. So we have different countries we deal with, different business units within those countries, business units that spawn across the countries. It's kind of a glorious mess. But we've been able to build buckets either for countries or for business units. It's worked pretty well. For the app, I use either SQL or SSRS or SSAS or SSIS. Lets me define permissions in that application. And then something that says, this is what I'm assigning permissions to. It may be the name of an AG. It may be a particular machine. It may be a friendly name like I could say US-SQL-DW. And I know that that's the US data warehouse server that I'm granting permission to. And then when I'm granting, and I have some standard names like read-only, deploy, writer, and a few others, but just 3 or 4 names cover almost all of them. Then a modifier. For example, if it only applies to certain databases, or it's only for certain schemas, or it's limited in some way, I put some kind of description on it at the end. And so there's some example there at the bottom. The US SQL TXN deploy lets you deploy code to the transaction host for the US database server. If you have to deploy stuff that does decryption of stuff, then you've got to be in this other special group, the decrypt group. The applications that do backups, say you've got to be in US SQL DW backup, or maybe there's a global US SQL backup group. And it should be pretty obvious by looking at the name of the group what it can do. And on the other side, if you have a thing you want something to be able to do, it should be pretty obvious what the name of the group is you should expect to find there. And the last is groups for people. Well, actually, it's the middle. Groups for people versus groups for permissions. The bigger your environment gets, the more you're probably going to get pushed into a world where you have a set of groups that group people together for their function. Accountants, sales reps, IT people, DBAs, whatever, and separate sets of groups that are the permissions that deploy the things that I just described. And the way people get permission is the groups get dropped into the groups. And then rather than giving an individual person permissions everywhere, they might have to be in a dozen groups. You say, hey, they're a account rep, or they're a IT DBA or something. They get dropped in that group, and then they get the permissions everywhere they need. The challenge with those is that those groups that group people together are often used for different things, and people gradually begin to get put in and that really aren't in those groups, but that's got a really good set of permissions, so we're going to put that person in to solve that problem. And so your permissions will just begin to expand and grow the number of people that can have it. So just be aware as you see that transitioning happening, as you get bigger and bigger, know that's out there waiting for you.
You ever? I've written a little routine I call it my group crawler, and it'll take a group, list all the members, and if there's any groups within a group, it'll list those members. I think I only go 2 iterations deep. But have you know what I mean? You know, when you have you may wonder, how the heck is that person getting into this database? It must be in a group. You don't see them, but yet there's a nested group. Have you ever have any good script for running? Try to crawl the AD for a particular person?
I actually have a really, really good script. So if you're in the world of SOX audits, you have to do quarterly account reviews of permissions on in-scope servers. And so I wrote a really, really good script that presents it in a great way that people can just review it, look at it, check it off. We actually did it on paper. It's a lot easier. I have to go buy them lunch once a quarter, and their price for lunch is they have to sit and review security accounts. The problem is it sits behind a client's code environment, and I've not really pushed to get it to be open source because while it looks really good on the end, the code that it runs is, it was me learning how to get into Active Directory in C#. So I know there are PowerShell functions that if you give it the name of a group, it will traverse that path for you, but it won't give you all the intermediate steps. You'd have to go hunt for them, which is one of the reasons I really try and keep it to be people in my permission group and not groups inside groups inside groups inside groups.
Yeah, I was just asking for a headache.
Yeah, good luck with that. If I can ever get my thing approved and cleaned up enough, I'll get it released. But right now it's got enough stuff hard coded into it for this one particular environment, because there's different domains that behave differently. Like, hey, if you're in this domain and you see a login for this, you can't actually go traverse that, so just skip that one, and then you have to run that in the other domain. And I need to get it cleaned up. So, but good question, good point. So, I don't know that my link server or my security group naming is the be all end all for you. But I think the really big takeaway is to start building some groups and start using those to grant permissions and start trying to simplify and standardize what you do. It'll make a whole lot of things a whole lot easier as you go along. I joke a lot that part of my job is to make future Bill's life easier because past Bill is causing me no end of trouble. So this is one of those things that can make future Bill's life easier. All right. Well, if there are not questions on security group names, we are going to do one monster slide of security best practices. So I sort of kind of a little bit maybe sort of have these in the order of importance that I think they are. But for almost anything, you could make a case that something should be moved higher or lower pretty easily. First is disable the SA, and before you disable it, set a long, complicated password unknown to you at it. I would encourage you to never, ever use the SA account for anything. It can still own objects if it's disabled. It owns all the databases. It owns all the SQL Server agent jobs. Just don't allow it to be used for a login. XP command shell is disabled by default. You should keep it disabled by default. Hey, there's a great little configuration tool that I know of that will test your server every time you run it and tell you if it is or not. If you do need to run something on command shell, run it through SQL Server agent in a command exec task, and you can configure a proxy for it there. And then that's very limited as to what it can do, and it's probably the best way to do that. Link servers, I made my sales pitch on. They are a great way if you ever decide to be a hacker to get into other servers with higher permission. So I'd encourage you to lock yours down. If you can keep applications from running as SA or DBO, you'll be much happier in the future. Limit system administrators. So one thing that I always try and do is have one login that gives me read-only permissions to do, email and whatever I'm doing, and then a separate login that I have to go do any changes for that. And you can do clever things like when you launch SSMS as this other login, you can change the background color of it so it's pretty obvious that you're in it in production. But what you should really do is change your regular background. And so anytime you see no color, you should just think, I may be in production, I should be careful. One of the environments I'm in, we have to RDP with two-factor to a whole nother server, so that makes that process a lot simpler. But think about not accidentally running as administrator, and especially don't use the same login that you log into development to do things to log into production and do things, because I guarantee you'll do something in the wrong environment sooner or later. As much as you can, enforce permissions at the group level. We've even gone as far at one of the organizations that every service account isn't actually one service account, it's two service accounts, and we grant permissions to the group, and then we can do rolling password changes much, much easier on that. They run fleets of application servers that connect to the database servers, and that lets us do rolling password upgrades across the dozen or so application servers. The other thing you can do for that is group managed service accounts. You've got to be on a newer version of SQL Server and a newer Active Directory. But basically what you get are an account without a password. And so there's no password to reset. So multiple different servers can run and multiple applications can log in as that. It cannot be used interactively, only to run as a service. So it takes a lot of the security configuration of that. It makes it just go away once it's set up the first time. If you live in the SOX world, they will often ask you to prove that your passwords are complex. And if you enforce that domain policy for your SQL Server logins, you can say, hey, they just follow the domain policy. Makes that a much simpler discussion to have. I used to always say SQL Server service accounts and never run as local, as the local system accounts. And I'm gradually starting to change and say run as local system accounts. And a couple of things are leaning to that. It's just safer, less privileges. The rise of backup appliances means that those VMs are getting backed up out from under, and I don't have to run backups that write to network shares. So I would encourage you to start with those local system virtual accounts and then move to domain accounts when you have to. And if you're looking at starting availability groups, I'd start with a group managed service account shared across all your nodes of that availability group before I'd look at a domain service account. Guest is disabled. I'd encourage you to keep it disabled and not grant any permissions to public. The one exception is if you have a trigger-based audit system. So whenever you make a change to a table, a trigger fires and it writes a row into another database in that table. You've either got to make sure your permissions match all the way between the two databases, which if you're doing it all by groups should be pretty easy to do, or you can cheat and be lazy and grant guest or public the ability to do an insert into that schema or that database. So they can't delete data, they can't select data, they can't delete data, but they can insert new rows. So it's kind of a simpler way to grant that. That's the only situation I run into that I wasn't horribly upset when I saw guest or public being used. Patch. SQL Server 0 days are pretty rare, and almost always you've got to get through some other things to get to SQL Server, but just keep the patches current. Every developer will tell you at some point, hey, if you could just put this linked server in to go from development to production, that would make my life so much easier because I could pull down all this test data and life would be really good. Please don't do that. Don't have any links that get easily from dev to prod. Make that be a separate login, maybe even a separate RDP. Make that hard to do. Try to avoid
subnet it off too.
Subnet it off, yeah. Different domains, different subnets, a lot of different things you can do. Just make that hard to do. I would avoid shared accounts for applications. Everybody wants to go do something like build a read-only account and then just use that everywhere. The next thing you know, you've got 50 things using this read-only account and you have to change the password and it becomes a nightmare. So avoid those if you can and try and use domain accounts where you can. In your extended event sessions, I would capture all your logins and login failures. And if you're in a high security world, you've got to find some way to review new logins and new login failures on a daily basis. And then begin to audit any security events. So every time anybody creates a new login, everybody grants a new permission, that should be audited and potentially reviewed by somebody. And then last is encrypting connections. It's not terribly common to encrypt traffic between an application and the SQL Server. And the login process that exchanges passwords is encrypted by default. However, if your application lets a user type in a username and a password into a web form and then passes that back to SQL Server, chances are that bit is not encrypted. So you'll want to think about encrypting that. And that is my, I don't even know how many minutes that was, 7-minute spiel on security best practices. Any questions on those?
I just got one thing to add. I'm sorry.
No, John.
The third from the bottom on the left, on the right, capture all logins and login failures. You know, you could do that in your SQL error log. It also goes to the Windows application log. We've used like, was it RSA? I always call it SEMI, but SEMI or S. It's whatever that acronym is for the security. Yeah. So yeah, it pulls in all these different logs so that, you know, auditors use them. Yeah. And one thing that we noticed for some applications are chatty, and so they have a lot of log in, log off per transaction, and so we had to change our Windows application log file size from the default of, I think it may be 4 meg to like 4 gig, because sometimes they were start rolling over, and before the systematic or whoever the RSA tool could, you know, poll it and pull that info. I don't know if you've ever used those third-party tools to capture all that audit information. Yeah. But that's the thing I got burnt on, is we're having gaps, and like, why are we having gaps? Well, it's because they're getting overwritten, because by default it's only like 4 meg Windows event You have your event, your system log, and
Yeah.
app log.
Yeah. Fortunately, the Windows logging is not my problem at all the places I work. That's somebody else's problem. And in SQL Server, I can configure fairly large storage blocks for the logins. And we do, the two ways that I store those are, we put them all in here, and I didn't do this for my demo, but certainly we could have put all the logins here and have them as a way to filter. And then I've also got little utilities that go pull those out and push them to one central database. And let me tell you, clustered column store indexes work fantastic for that. They're a great way to shrink that data down, 20-to-1 compression on those kinds of things.
Yeah, those
All right.
auditors are certainly else. They always want stuff, but they never give you a script to run it.
Oh, no.
They tell you, just do a screenshot or something, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And then they're like, well, we need to see your artifacts on what you ran. It's like,
Yep.
why don't you just give me something to run?
Yep. Yeah, and I hear, and I have the same complaints, and the answer they always give me back is, if we give you the script, then we're auditing ourselves. And I'm like,
See why?
yeah. All right. Any other security questions? All right. So this comes to the fun part of it. I am almost done. My last thing is I'm going to give you a game recommendation for quarantine. I am a longtime game fan, and I thought that things like Risk and Monopoly were the best games in the entire world. And then I played Seven Wonders, and I was hooked. It is a competitive game, but much, I don't know, it's harder to tell who's winning and losing. And so you find a lot less conflict when you play the game. It's also hard to know, if you're really ahead or behind while it's going. People don't get eliminated early, and people aren't, like in Risk, very weak and in a corner. You're never in that situation. There's also limited direct confrontation between people. It is just a great, great group game, and really kind of changed how I thought about games. Sold out on Amazon. It is in stock in many local Targets. So there's your free game advice for your lockdown time. With that, I am done. This presentation is not up there. In the next day or two, I will get this uploaded. And you can download some of the scripts and the content. Hopefully that SQL Server best practices can be a nice little checklist. And the thing that I'd really ask you all to do is to go download that desired state configuration thing and test it out and send me any feedback, what you like, what you don't like. I'd love to get some more feedback on that. With that, I will take any other questions you have.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and at least stop the recording at this point, and we'll continue with questions.